Chapter 1. A Village of Quiet Whispers. The London train slowed to a gentle halt beside the modest platform of St Mary Mead, steam hissing about Jessica Fletcher's ankles as she alighted with practiced grace. It was late April, the sort of brisk spring morning that smelt of new grass and damp stone. Beyond the iron railings stretched an orderly village of whitewashed cottages, clipped hedgerows, and cherry trees bent beneath pink blossom. Jessica drew a satisfied breath. Even after decades of crime writing and occasional sleuthing, she still found these postcard hamlets disarmingly peaceful, like china teacups that might, at any moment, show a crack. A small welcoming committee approached. First came Miss Jane Marple herself, trim in dove-grey tweed and bearing a smile as sharp as her blue eyes. At her elbow toddled Dolly Bantry, wide-brimmed hat, listing under an armful of floral bunting for the forthcoming literary and horticultural fête. Bringing up the rear was the vicar, Reverend Leonard Clement, tall, polite, and already fretting over schedules. "My dear Mrs. Fletcher," said Miss Marple, pressing Jessica's hand, "how perfectly splendid you could join our little festival. Colonel Bantry has insisted you stay at the Grange. He is convinced a house once graced by a murder, or two, ought to host a famous mystery author." Jessica chuckled. "I'm honoured, Miss Marple, though I do hope your colonel doesn't intend to supply fresh material." "Oh, let us pray not," murmured the vicar, crossing himself with comic haste. Carpet bag collected, Jessica strolled up the gravel path to Bantry Grange. The manor stood Regency proud, behind lawns studded with cowslips. Inside, morning tea had been laid. Delicate china, currant scones, and a crimson jar of the Bantry's prized strawberry preserve. Conversation fluttered, the way it does among friends, who half listen and half take stock. Jessica observed Colonel Bantry's cane, leaning abandoned against a bergère chair, its silver ferrule newly dented. She noticed, too, a smear of varnish on Dolly's glove and a faint patch of plaster dust on the colonel's trouser cuff. Renovations, she concluded, though she wondered why neither had mentioned any repairs. They were joined by Giles Radcliffe, chairman of the Fête Committee, a florid man with an orator's boom and a banker's impatience. He griped about overspent budgets while twisting the heavy signet ring on his finger. "Programme still at the printers," he barked. "If the pages are smudged, I shall have their hides. Our American guest," he inclined his head at Jessica, "deserves something better than provincial ink blots." Jessica sipped her tea. "Bad printing rarely ruins a good story, Mr. Radcliffe." "Perhaps," he growled, "but sloppy accounts certainly can." The remark earned him a reproving glance from Miss Marple, yet Jessica saw real worry behind it. Budget rows were mundane, yes, but they often masked subtler resentment.
Rows were mundane, yes, but they often masked subtler resentments. That afternoon the village green bustled with preparations. Marquees rising, coconut shies assembled, and bunting looped like festive spiderwebs. Jessica wandered among it all, notebook tucked discreetly beneath her arm. She chatted with Mrs. Price Ridley, who complained that her dahlias were being unfairly judged, and listened to young schoolmaster Peter Abbott lament the disappearance of his brass telescope, last seen after an evening of stargazing with pupils. A telescope, Jessica mused, would fetch a handsome price in the right antique shop. Near the library she glimpsed a scene of muted acrimony, Giles Radcliffe standing stiffly beside Beatrice Carson, the Fate's gentle treasurer. Beatrice clutched a slim ledger, its pages fluttering in the breeze like trapped moths. Giles spoke low but emphatic. She replied with a resigned shake of the head. When she turned away, Jessica noticed tears sheened in the woman's lashes. A moment later, Beatrice vanished into the church hall, ledger clamped to her chest. Jessica approached the spot they'd quarrelled and crouched, as though studying the soil. In truth, she noted something else entirely. A single brass button stamped with a rampant lion. It lay half buried in grass and bore a faint smear of crimson wax. She pocketed the button and strolled on, mind knitting strands of curiosity. Evening found the village assembled in the library for Mr. Radcliffe's keynote address. Good books and better accounting. Shelves of calfskin volumes rose like watchful jurors, the lamps casting golden pools across polished oak. Jessica sat beside Miss Marple in the second row. Colonel Bantry snoozed discreetly 2 seats down. At the lectern jars, Radcliffe shuffled notes with theatrical importance, yet his eyes flicked repeatedly toward the side door, perhaps searching for Beatrice. She did not appear. Radcliffe began. 5 minutes in, the light sputtered. A collective gasp fluttered through the room as darkness swallowed rows of listeners. Someone muttered about the fuse box. Another suggested mischief by local youths. In the murk, Jessica caught an acrid tang, burnt insulation, and a soft thud as though a sack of wheat had fallen. Then came a hushed, awful silence. The lamps flared again. All faces turned instinctively toward the source of the strange sound. Giles Radcliffe lay sprawled at the foot of the lectern, eyes glassy, mouth frozen mid-word. A crimson stain seeped across his starched shirt front, creeping like ivy over gravestone marble. At his side rested a paper knife, its ornate handle broken, the blade lost. Jessica's heart quickened, but her voice remained calm. "No one move," she instructed, her New England quiet slicing through rising panic. "Reverend Clement, summon the constable. Colonel, please, close those doors. Miss Marple, will you keep everyone seated? We mustn't disturb the scene." She knelt beside the body, the wound a single deep puncture. Chapter 2: Shadows in the Ledger Room. The following morning broke bright and deceptively warm, sunlight dancing over the gravestones in the village churchyard and dappling the cobbled high street. But inside the library, the chill had not lifted, not from the air nor from the faces of those who had borne witness to Giles Radcliffe's collapse. Jessica Fletcher arrived early, having slept little. She'd spent much of the night replaying every sound and glance from the moment the lights had flickered out to the discovery of the body. Though no official word had yet been given, she felt certain Radcliffe had not suffered a natural death. The blade wound, the broken handle, and the burned ledger fragment all pointed to deliberate action. Calculated, cold. Sergeant Dennis Trelaw, the local constable, a mild-mannered man more accustomed to bicycle theft and fence disputes, stood at the entrance to the library. He greeted Jessica with a wary nod. "Morning, Mrs. Fletcher. Miss Marple said you might be along. You'll find the place undisturbed. Well, mostly." Dr. Lloyd had a look. Said the cause was what you guessed. Clean puncture, most likely instant. Jessica thanked him and entered. The once bustling library now echoed with solemnity. Chairs were still askew, some bearing half-sipped teacups. The lectern lay on its side where it had toppled with Radcliffe. A faint stain darkened the carpet below. Jessica moved with care, her sharp eyes scanning the room not for blood, but for disturbances, what was out of place or perhaps too perfectly in place. She was soon joined by Miss Marple, dressed in her usual lavender cardigan, and smelling faintly of lavender water. "I rather thought you'd come early," said Miss Marple softly. "It's in your nature." Jessica smiled. "And yours too, I think." Miss Marple nodded gravely. "It's a most unsettling business, isn't it? Mr. Radcliffe was not liked, I'm afraid, but murder does seem excessive." Jessica's brow furrowed. "You've known him long?" "Oh yes, chairman of the fête these past 7 years. Quite forceful, fond of procedure, not warm, I'd say, but he kept things in line." She paused, then added, "He had enemies, not the loud kind, the quiet, patient sort." Jessica considered that. "And Miss Carson? Beatrice?" "Sweet thing, dreadfully anxious lately. Her mother's unwell and she's been managing all the accounts for the fête herself. She told me on Tuesday she'd found a discrepancy. Several checks she hadn't signed off. I suggested she speak with Mr. Radcliffe." Jessica stiffened. "That must be the conversation I saw yesterday." "I rather suspect so. And if what she discovered was damning, then she's in danger," Jessica said quickly. "Or being framed." Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "I see you've already taken to the village, Mrs. Fletcher." Before they could speak further, Reverend Clement stepped in, his face solemn. "Mrs. Fletcher, Miss Marple, if I might impose, I think you should see the ledger room." The room in question was a small office attached to the back of the library, lined with wooden filing cabinets and a large safe bolted to the floor. The smell of old paper and faint mildew lingered, but what caught Jessica's attention immediately was the open cabinet drawer and the blackened remains of several papers inside. The burn had been precise, controlled even, leaving only the edges and corners untouched. "The fire didn't spread," the vicar explained, "but the bulk of the financial records are gone." Jessica frowned. That's curious, a fire so small yet so effective. Indeed, it was discovered late last night by the verger, said the vicar. He was locking up and smelt smoke, extinguished it with a damp tea towel. Jessica bent and examined the drawer. A thin trail of ash had spilled onto the floor. Nearby she spotted something half-melted, a wax seal red, with the imprint of a lion's head. It matched the one she'd found on the brass button yesterday. She turned it over with a gloved finger. Somebody wanted very particular records destroyed, she said quietly, and they knew exactly where to find them. The vicar hesitated. Miss Carson had access, but so did Mr. Radcliffe and the printer, young Abbott. Jessica's gaze sharpened. Peter Abbott, the school teacher? Yes, he volunteers here 2 evenings a week. He's quite organised, catalogues the fête flyers, handles the printing lists. That makes at least 3 people who had opportunity, Miss Marple murmured, and at least one with motive, Jessica added, recalling the tension between Beatrice and Radcliffe. But I'm not ready to believe guilt by nerves. Leaving the library, Jessica wandered down to Blossom Lane, a quiet curving path lined with primrose hedges and terracotta pots. It was here in a modest whitewashed cottage that Beatrice Carson lived with her ailing mother. The windows were shuttered, but the faint sound of piano music floated out, a soft, hesitating lullaby. Jessica knocked gently. After a moment, the door creaked open. Beatrice appeared, her face pale and drawn, eyes red-rimmed. I know I shouldn't be speaking to anyone, she said quietly. But I trust you? Jessica stepped inside. The home was tidy but bore signs of quiet distress. Teacups left cooling, a cardigan draped across the back of a chair, unopened mail. On the table sat a folder marked, Fate Finances, I didn't kill him. Beatrice said suddenly, her voice trembling. I argued with him, yes, he'd written 3 checks in my name, checks I never approved. When I confronted him, he told me to keep quiet or he'd say I was incompetent. I wanted to go to the vicar. But? He said if I did, someone would get hurt. Jessica studied her. Beatrice, the drawer where the records were kept. Do you know who else had the key? Beatrice nodded faintly. Only Giles and me, but Peter Abbott. He knew the combination to the safe. He helped set it when the old lock jammed. Did he know about the discrepancies?
I don't think so. But he was strange lately, nervous. Jessica stood to leave. Beatrice, I believe you, but you must stay close to someone trustworthy. Don't be alone. That afternoon, Jessica paid a visit to Peter Abbott at the school. The young man greeted her with wide, wary eyes. I didn't kill him, he blurted before she could even sit. Then why are you so nervous? He looked away. Because I know what happens to people who talk too much in small towns. Jessica folded her arms. Try me. Peter hesitated, then said, Radcliffe was blackmailing someone, not Beatrice, someone with real money. I saw him with envelopes, red wax seals. He said it was nothing, fake business, but I know better. Jessica's mind raced. The lion seal, the payments, the fire. Someone had a secret, one worth killing for, and now they'd begun covering their tracks. As she stepped out into the late afternoon sun, Jessica turned once more to the church tower clock. Time was running fast in St Mary Mead, and whoever had struck once would likely strike again.
Chapter 3. Tea, Treason and Twine. By the following morning, the usually genial mood of St Mary Mead had curdled like cream left out in the sun. The murder of Giles Radcliffe had broken through the crust of village civility. Now, every twitching curtain, every polite smile across a garden fence carried suspicion behind it. Jessica Fletcher walked through the market square, her scarf pulled against the brisk breeze. She stopped at Mrs. Biddle's tea rooms not for a pot of Assam, but for information. If there was one thing a village murder did well, it was stir the tongues of patrons halfway through their biscuits. Inside, the scent of cinnamon buns and gossip hung thick. Mrs. Biddle herself, 40 years in the same pinstriped apron, glanced up from her register with startled delight. Mrs. Fletcher, come for the plum tart, I hope? Jessica smiled gently. Actually, I was hoping for a quiet table and something hot. The corner seat was ideal. From here, Jessica could observe without intruding. Miss Hartnell and Mrs. Godfrey, 2 village widows with sharp hearing and sharper tongues, sat in the booth nearest the window. I still say it's that Abbott boy, Miss Hartnell hissed, buttering her crumpet with unholy force.
He's too clever by half. Astronomy, plays the organ, and never once dated that poor Maeve Ellis. Always something off about him. Mrs. Godfrey shook her head. I heard it was blackmail. Between you and me, Beatrice's mother was once a nurse at the asylum near Wells. Perhaps Mr. Radcliffe discovered something sensitive? Jessica didn't react, but mentally filed the notion. Not because she believed it, but because even lies pointed to truths someone wanted buried. Soon after, Miss Marple entered the tea shop, greeted Jessica, and sat opposite her. I've spoken with the printer, she said in a hush. He says the fate program proofs were taken from his office the morning before the murder. No trace of who signed them out. Forged signature? Very likely. But here's something odder. He swears the financial sponsors listed in the draft don't match the ones submitted to the parish committee 2 weeks ago. Jessica sipped her tea, padding accounts perhaps, or replacing legitimate donors with shell names. Miss Marple nodded slowly. It would explain the missing records. And the urgency to destroy them, Jessica murmured. Just then, Dolly Bantry burst in, cheeks flushed and hair windblown. You'll never believe it, she whispered. The vicar's gardener just found something behind the hedge near the east wall. Twine, the thick brown kind you see on library parcels, tied in a loop. And guess what was hanging from it? Jessica and Miss Marple both leaned forward. What? They said in unison. A button, Dolly whispered. Another one, brass, with that same lion symbol. Jessica stood abruptly. Where exactly? Near the tool shed, close to where the fate stage was being assembled. Within the hour, the 3 women were at the vicarage garden, where Sergeant Treloar knelt over the discovery site. The loop of twine was tied in a makeshift noose, with the second brass button caught inside. Jessica bent and picked it up. Same pattern, she said. Same red wax. Odd, isn't it? Treloar muttered. Almost like it was planted. Or dropped while hiding something, Jessica corrected. Sergeant, have you considered the possibility that the real target wasn't Radcliffe at all? Treloar blinked. Come again? Jessica's voice was calm but clipped. What if the knife wasn't meant for him? What if he interrupted something? Someone burning records, for instance. Treloar scratched his head. Could be. But then why threaten Beatrice? Because blackmail can have more than one thread, Jessica replied. And I think this one's tangled deeper than we know. They were interrupted by the arrival of Peter Abbott, his satchel slung across his shoulder. He looked agitated, lips tight. I want to talk, he said, eyes on Jessica. Now, somewhere quiet. They convened at the vestry hall. Peter removed a thin envelope from his satchel and handed it to Jessica. Inside were 3 photographs, all taken from a distance, slightly grainy. One showed Giles Radcliffe outside the library. The second showed him with a woman gloved, with her back turned, exchanging an envelope. The third was more curious, Radcliffe again, entering a house on the outskirts of the village, a house Jessica recognized. Isn't this Mrs. Denville's old cottage? She asked. Peter nodded. It was sold last year, quietly. No announcement, but I heard Radcliffe was going there regularly. Jessica narrowed her eyes. Whose house is it now? Peter hesitated. That's just it. It's owned by a trust based in London. No public records, but someone lives there, a woman. I saw her once briefly. Red gloves, fur collar, didn't match any local I know. Miss Marple's brow wrinkled. Perhaps someone from his past. Jessica stared at the photos again. Something about the woman seemed familiar, not in face, which was hidden, but in posture. Composed, controlled, dangerous. That evening, while the village gathered for a memorial service at the church, Jessica made her way to the Denville cottage. The path was overgrown, and the air oddly still. A low garden wall circled the house like a moat. She approached the door and knocked. No answer. But from inside, she could hear faint movement, footsteps, then silence. She was about to leave when the door creaked open. A woman stood there, tall, cloaked in dark velvet, her gloved hands clasped. You shouldn't be here, the woman said coldly. I could say the same to you, Jessica replied. I'm in mourning. For Radcliffe? For what he threatened to expose. The door closed in her face. Jessica walked away, her thoughts racing. Whoever this woman was, she knew more than she let on, and her presence in the village was no accident. By the time Jessica returned to Bantry Grange, Miss Marple was waiting with news. I've gone through the fate budgets, she said.
There's one sponsor listed in both the final and forged versions, Harrington and Co., except they've not traded in 15 years. They were shut down for tax fraud. Jessica stared at her. Then whoever submitted that name did so to launder something, or someone, Miss Marple said. I believe we're dealing with not just a killer, but an old crime resurfaced. Jessica folded her arms. And now the past is trying to stay buried, even if it means killing again. Chapter 4. The Woman in Red Gloves. The fourth morning since Giles Radcliffe's murder dawned with an unsettling quiet over St Mary Mead. The usual clink of milk bottles and bird chatter was dulled by tension. The villagers now glanced over their shoulders, and conversations faltered when footsteps passed by. Jessica Fletcher stood at the drawing-room window of Bantry Grange, stirring her tea absent-mindedly as she watched the gardener trim a row of laurels. The scent of damp earth drifted through the window. Something about the calm felt wrong, as though the village were collectively holding its breath. A knock sounded at the door. Colonel Bantry, still in his tartan dressing gown, shuffled past her to answer it. Moments later, Miss Marple swept in, coat buttoned high, her expression unusually grave. "She's gone," she said by way of greeting. "Who?" asked Jessica, though she had a guess already forming. "The woman from the Denville cottage, left at first light. The neighbour's cat spooked and climbed onto the shed roof. It always gives a good view. I believe the woman packed only one small case. Did anyone see her leave?" "The postmaster's daughter. A black motorcar collected her. No plates. She couldn't see the driver." Jessica set her cup down. "We need to know who she was. That house is connected to Radcliffe. Peter Abbott's photographs prove it." Miss Marple nodded. "And I've been thinking about that button, the one you found by the hedge. I went to the old village records. That rampant lion symbol belonged to a gentleman's society based in London, early 20th century. Very exclusive. Mainly ex-colonials, retired civil servants. One of their founders was Radcliffe's grandfather." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "So the buttons could have belonged to Radcliffe himself. Or," Miss Marple said carefully, "to someone else still trying to carry on that legacy." Later that day, Jessica paid a visit to the village's solicitor, Mr. Crail, under the pretext of reviewing her speaking contract for the fête. The old man, a relic of Edwardian politeness, lived among towers of yellowing ledgers. Jessica posed her questions with gentle charm. "I wonder if you might help me with a legal curiosity, Mr. Crail. Suppose an old organization, long dissolved, still held private assets. Might those be redirected into personal accounts by a clever trustee?" Crail blinked behind thick spectacles. "Mrs. Fletcher, such a thing would be highly irregular, but theoretically, yes. If no one were monitoring the accounts, and if the names were adjusted to seem legitimate, it could be possible." Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "And if the trustee feared exposure?" "Well," said Crail, folding his hands, "he might burn documents, intimidate others, even take more desperate steps." She left with her suspicions strengthened. This wasn't simply a murder. It was the cover-up of a decades-old financial network. Giles Radcliffe, by either greed or inheritance, had unearthed something potent and potentially criminal, and someone had made sure he wouldn't talk. That evening, the vicar called a special parish council meeting. Jessica and Miss Marple attended alongside Beatrice Carson, Peter Abbott, Dolly Bantry, and a few others. Sergeant Trelaw stood near the back, watchful but quiet. Vicar Clement opened the floor solemnly. "We are gathered to ensure the fête proceeds respectfully. In light of recent events, the community mustn't fracture." Murmurs of agreement, guilt and concern rippled around the room. Beatrice stood next. Her voice was soft but clear. "There's something I need to share. I was the one who called Mr. Radcliffe to the library that evening. I discovered the altered records 2 days before. I confronted him. He told me the sponsors were historic partners and that I should leave it be. But I didn't. I threatened to tell the committee. That's why we argued." No one interrupted. She went on. "That night, I returned to the ledger room after the meeting began. I wanted to retrieve proof. The drawer was already open. Someone had been there first.
When the lights went out, I heard a struggle, but I froze. I never saw the attacker. I'm sorry. Peter rose to speak next. I've been working with Mrs. Fletcher. I believe Radcliffe was using the Fate's finances to launder funds from old accounts, possibly criminal in origin. I saw him with envelopes bearing a wax seal. I thought it best to keep quiet, but now, Jessica nodded. Thank you, Peter. That confirms what I suspected. The room went silent. Then Sergeant Trelaw said, This wax seal, do you still have it? Jessica opened her handbag and removed the small scorched lump she'd recovered from the ledger room. It's partial, but the lion's head is distinct, same as the buttons. Trelaw frowned. Then someone else must have been in that room. Possibly before Beatrice arrived, possibly the murderer. Dolly Bantry, never one to hold back, leaned in. Well then, who's the woman from the Denville cottage? Everyone turned. Miss Marple spoke softly. I made inquiries. The house is owned by a shell company registered under a Mrs. C. Dunsmore. She was once married to a man named Charles Radcliffe, Giles's uncle. He vanished in the 1980s after being implicated in a finance scandal. She's been hiding here for weeks. Peter whispered. Then she's the one Radcliffe was blackmailing. Jessica's eyes narrowed. Or she's the one who started all this? Before the meeting could continue, the lights flickered. A gust of wind rattled the church hall windows. From the back came a sudden clatter, a chair overturned, a gasp. Jessica ran toward the noise. There, half hidden in shadow, was the vicar's gardener, collapsed, a fresh gash on his temple, and beside him, a brass-handled knife. The blade matched the missing fragment from the paper knife used to kill Radcliffe. Jessica knelt and picked up a scrap of red cloth snagged on a bench nail. Red velvet, she said, just like the woman's cloak. Miss Marple joined her. Then the killer didn't leave town. She's still here, watching, silencing. Jessica straightened, and she's getting desperate. Chapter 5. The Cloak, the Clock, and the Secret Room. Evening descended over St Mary Mead with a kind of eerie reluctance, as if the village itself were too nervous to sleep. The gas lamps flickered against cottage windows, their glow distorted by rain-specked panes. Jessica Fletcher, walking briskly through the dimly lit high street beside Miss Marple, could feel tension in every shuttered window and in every echoing step. We need to act fast, Jessica said, voice low and urgent. The attack on the gardener, it wasn't to kill him. It was a warning. Someone wants to frighten us off the trail. Miss Marple nodded, her gloved hands tucked neatly into her cloak pockets. Whoever she is, our cloaked visitor is very bold. But desperate people make mistakes. I suggest we revisit the Denville cottage tonight, before anything else goes missing. The idea was risky. The woman in the red velvet cloak, presumably Mrs. C. Dunsmore, had already fled once, and yet she had returned. Jessica suspected she was still hiding in the village, somewhere secret, somewhere familiar. They reached the edge of the village just past 9 o'clock. The Denville cottage stood quiet and black against the moonlight. Jessica had borrowed the key from the parish records officer under the guise of recovering fate property. She and Miss Marple entered silently. The air inside was stale with soot and lavender oil. The sitting room remained untouched, books stacked precisely, a decanter of untouched sherry on the sideboard. But Jessica moved past these, heading instead for the hallway near the rear. Her intuition was pulling her toward the grandfather clock. She inspected the tall oak cabinet, its hands frozen at exactly 2:47. Odd time, she murmured. That's not the current hour. Miss Marple ran her fingers along the side. This clock is too shallow to house such a complex mechanism. Jessica felt the wood below the face. Her hand caught a faint notch, and then, with the faintest click, the front panel swung open to reveal a narrow, hidden space. Inside was a cache of papers bound with twine, and something wrapped in red velvet, folded neatly, as if ready to wear. Jessica unwrapped it slowly. The cloak, and inside its lining, tucked discreetly in a hidden seam, was a small key. Well, said Miss Marple, smiling grimly, that certainly wasn't from the haberdashery. Jessica turned to the papers, among them old letters, all addressed to Charles Radcliffe, postmarked from Zurich, Lisbon and Morocco. Names were code names, bank accounts were hidden in offshores, and in the center of the bundle, an envelope marked "For Giles." She opened it. Inside was a letter in an elegant female hand.
If you're reading this, then you know too much. I did what I could to keep the trust buried, but someone has spoken. I warned you once, and now I must act. This cannot be undone, not after what we did to protect the family. Do not involve the fate. It was your vanity that dragged it into this. If you persist, you will not be warned again. Jessica stared at the final line. Seedy. Catherine Dunsmore, she murmured. The cloak, the warning, it was her. She was silencing Giles to protect the Radcliffe legacy. Miss Marple, however, had turned her attention to the key. But this, she said, holding it to the moonlight, this is not a house key. This is for a strongbox. Jessica's mind clicked. And where in the village has a strongbox still untouched? They exchanged a look. The church, said Jessica, the old archives vault. 15 minutes later, they stood beneath the ancient stone arches of St Mary Mead Church. Reverend Clement had answered their urgent knock with confusion, but upon hearing their theory and seeing the key, he agreed to let them in. The vault, located beneath the nave, was cold and lined with iron racks of ledgers dating back centuries. In one corner sat a thick metal box, long rusted at the hinges. Jessica turned the key. Inside, amid dust and the smell of mildew, lay a tidy leather-bound journal. On its first page, The Harrington Society, Personal Notes by Charles Radcliffe. She opened it slowly. Inside was a damning list. False donors, code names, amounts transferred via fate fundraisers across 3 decades. It was proof of everything Giles had likely uncovered and the real reason he'd been killed. Miss Marple spoke first. This is bigger than any of us imagined. Jessica nodded. But there's still something missing. Giles didn't write this. His uncle did, and Charles disappeared in 1987. That means someone has been managing the cover-up since then. Reverend Clement frowned. But Charles Radcliffe was declared dead. I officiated the memorial service myself.
Jessica stared at him. Declared dead, but was he? The three exchanged glances. Just then, Sergeant Treloar arrived, out of breath. Come quickly, we've just found a body in the old ice house near the orchard. They hurried out to the orchard, where constables stood beneath the beam of torchlight. Inside the crumbling ice house, amid moss and rotted crates, was a body wrapped in a rotted overcoat. A ring still clung to a bony hand, the same signet ring Giles Radcliffe had always worn. Except this one had initials carved inside. C.R. Jessica took a slow breath. It's Charles Radcliffe. Miss Marple whispered, then Giles wasn't blackmailing his uncle, he was covering for him or hiding the truth. Sergeant Treloar looked stunned. But if Charles has been dead for years, then someone else wore that cloak, Jessica said. Someone using Catherine's name. Someone who wanted us to believe Catherine Dunsmore returned, when in truth she died long ago. Miss Marple looked almost sad. Then our killer isn't a Radcliffe, but someone close enough to know all their secrets. Jessica's eyes narrowed. And that means, she said softly, someone we've already spoken to. Chapter 6. The Quiet Hand Behind the Curtain. Morning mist hung over St Mary Mead like a veil, curling low over hedgerows and clinging to the gravestones in the churchyard. Jessica Fletcher stood at the gates of Bantry Grange, gazing toward the path that led through the orchard and past the old ice house, now cordoned off with police tape and guarded by 2 somber constables. The village was quieter than ever, as though the land itself were mourning the long-buried body found beneath it. Charles Radcliffe, the man thought, vanished abroad. The man whose crimes had supposedly faded with time. And yet, it wasn't Charles who had returned, wearing the red cloak, nor Catherine Dunsmore. Whoever had donned the costume threatened Giles and silenced him. It was someone else entirely. Inside the Granger's sitting room, Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands. It all keeps pointing backward, she said. Everyone thinks murder is about the moment, passion, heat. But here, no, this was planned, polished, quiet. Jessica nodded. We need to look at who benefits from silence, and who understood enough about the fate, the trust, and the old Radcliffe accounts to manipulate everything without drawing attention. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. I believe it's time we paid Beatrice another visit." Beatrice Carson opened the door with a hesitant expression, her eyes still shadowed by days of grief and tension. But Jessica noted something new, resolve. Perhaps it was the clarity that follows shock, or perhaps Beatrice was no longer afraid of being watched. "I've already told you everything I know," she said softly. "I believe you," Jessica replied, "but something's been bothering me. You said Giles wrote checks under your name, falsifying fête expenses." "Yes." "And you noticed this? How?" Beatrice hesitated. I checked the books weekly. I caught the mismatch." "But the accounts were filed by Peter Abbott. You don't usually keep them yourself, do you?" Her lips parted, confused. "No, but I've had access since last winter." "Why?" Jessica asked gently. "Because the former treasurer retired. And the vicar asked me to take over." Jessica and Miss Marple exchanged a glance. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Beatrice, are you aware that Reverend Clement was once employed at a theological seminary funded by the Harrington Trust?" Beatrice blinked. "No. But he always encouraged Giles, said the fête could fund scholarships, local development. I assumed it was all above board." Jessica's voice remained calm. "Did he ever handle financial documents directly?" "No. He always said he left numbers to the women." "Why are you asking this?"
Jessica sighed. "Because whoever has been hiding this for decades, whoever knew about the trust's laundering, about Charles's death, and about the fake donors, has to be someone with both long-term access and the intelligence to tie everything together quietly." Miss Marple added softly, "And someone who would benefit by appearing righteous, involved, and above suspicion." Beatrice paled. "You don't mean—" They found Reverend Leonard Clement in his study, the windows fogged with breath and pipe smoke. He looked up from his ledger book, surprised. "Ladies," he said warmly, "still hard at work, I see." Jessica stepped forward, holding the journal recovered from the church vault. "We found Charles Radcliffe's body in the ice house." The vicar's smile faltered. "My goodness. Where you presided over his memorial," Jessica added. He set down his pen, slower now. "And that journal?" he asked. "It details everything, the Harrington accounts, fate laundering, and a key you assigned to Beatrice, meant to keep her involved. Just enough to take the blame, weren't you?" Miss Marple's voice was soft but piercing. "It's always the quiet ones, Reverend. You kept the trust alive after Charles died. You built the cloak and dagger nonsense to maintain control. When Giles threatened to go public, you panicked." Clement leaned back slowly in his chair. "He had no discretion," he said simply. "The trust was doing good. Small grants to struggling parishes, repairs to historic buildings, none of it would have passed modern inspection." Jessica's voice was cold. "That wasn't your decision to make." He looked up, gaze almost sad. "No, I suppose not. But I didn't kill Giles, I only warned him." Miss Marple raised a brow. "Then who did?" The vicar stared past them, toward the high bookshelf. "Someone who loved him." Jessica's heart dropped. "You're not saying." "His own sister," said Clement quietly, "Edwina Radcliffe. She's lived abroad for years. She returned last month, under a false name. She stayed at the Denville cottage. She saw the mess Giles had made, and she acted." Jessica stood still. "The woman in the red cloak. Yes, and she's leaving again tonight." Jessica and Miss Marple alerted Sergeant Treloar immediately, and by dusk they stood near the edge of town, hidden just beyond the hedgerow that lined the only road leading out toward the motorway. At precisely 7:15 p.m., headlights appeared in the mist. A sleek black car crept along the lane, stopping briefly as the driver glanced at their wristwatch. Jessica stepped out. "Miss Edwina Radcliffe," she said, firm and clear. The driver stiffened. Treloar and another officer emerged from the trees. "Step out of the car." The woman did so, red-gloved hands, velvet cloak. Her face, older than the grainy photograph Peter Abbott had snapped, was proud and sharp-edged. "I did what had to be done," she said. "My family's legacy. Our name was being dragged through the dirt. Jessica looked at her squip. So you stabbed your own brother? Edwina did not flinch. He was going to tell everything. He left the papers in that church box. All I asked was silence. He refused. He chose the fate over blood. Trelaw stepped forward to arrest her, but Jessica's voice cut through. One more question, she said. Why return to the village at all? Edwina's eyes flickered. Because he wrote to me. He wanted to come clean. He thought I'd understand. He was wrong. Jessica watched silently as the officers led her to the car. Miss Marple stood beside her, hands folded. An entire web of silence, greed and guilt, she said. And it began long before Giles ever opened a checkbook. Jessica nodded, and yet it ended right here, on a quiet lane, with a red cloak in the dusk. Chapter 7. The Threads That Led to Murder. Rain fell in steady rhythm on the slates of Bantry Grange the morning after Edwina Radcliffe's arrest. The garden was soaked through, daffodils bowed low as though weary of secrets, and the roads glistened like black ribbon under grey clouds. Jessica Fletcher sat in the drawing room, her notebook open, her mind as sharp as ever, but a heaviness lingered behind her thoughts. Miss Marple entered quietly, a newspaper folded beneath her arm. It's made the Morning Chronicle, front page. Mystery woman behind village fete murder arrested, though they've downplayed the financial scandal, of course. Jessica gave a dry smile. No one likes to believe something as innocent as a flower show could become the center of a murder. Miss Marple poured them both tea. Still, you don't look satisfied. Jessica tapped her pen against the page. I'm not. She paused. Something's wrong, Jane. The evidence against Edwina, yes, it's compelling. The cloak, the key, the letters. But she left fingerprints on nothing. The knife, no prints. The letter to Giles, handwriting, yes, but no envelope. Not even a cent. She's proud, secretive, but I doubt she's careless. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Then you believe someone else used her as a cover. I believe someone knew she'd come, that she'd want to silence Giles but wouldn't dare, and someone else took advantage of that to commit the murder themselves. There was a long silence. Then Miss Marple said, Then we've not caught our murderer. Jessica stood. Not yet, but I think we're close. That afternoon Jessica visited the village library. With Radcliffe gone and the fete cancelled, the library sat abandoned, quiet, dusty, as though holding its breath. She moved to the ledger room again. She'd combed it twice before, but this time she paid close attention to the newer details. The ledgers that had survived the fire had been resealed, but one had a note inside, unsigned. Check the last ledger, not the figures, the fibers. Jessica frowned. That wasn't Giles' handwriting. She took the last financial record, opened it, and paused. At first glance, the pages were blank, but when she tilted one toward the light, faint lines appeared, indentations from a pen used on the page above. Someone had written on a sheet, laid over this one. She removed the blank upper page and shaded the impressions with a pencil. Words slowly appeared. He suspects me. He asked about the checks. I told him Beatrice made an error. It won't hold. Jessica's heart pounded. She had seen that handwriting before. This was... Moments later, she was standing at Peter Abbott's cottage. The young man looked pale when he opened the door. Mrs. Fletcher, please, I can't... You wrote the note, Jessica said firmly. The impression in the ledger. You lied to Giles. You framed Beatrice. Peter stared at her. Then slowly he nodded. She didn't know, he said. Beatrice, she just signed what I gave her. She's kind, sweet. She didn't see the mess, but I did. Why? Jessica asked softly. He looked away. Because Radcliffe was going to shut me out. I found the journal, Charles's journal, weeks ago when I was reorganizing the archive vault. I showed it to Giles. I thought he'd be furious like me, but he wanted to take it public. He clenched his jaw. That would have destroyed everything. Jessica said nothing. He threatened to expose the old trust, to tear it all down, and all I could think was, if it vanished, so would I. The fate gave me status. The trust paid for the school's new roof, and the printing press. My entire life is built on it.
You thought you were preserving a legacy. I thought I could frighten him. The letter, the cloak, pretending to be Edwina. I wanted to give him a warning, but he confronted me that night. He told me he was going to the police. Jessica stared. So you stabbed him? Peter's voice cracked. I didn't mean to. He lunged for the paper knife. I tried to pull it away and it broke. He looked so shocked. He didn't even scream. He sank onto a bench. I didn't plan it, not the murder, but when I realized what I'd done, I set the fire in the ledger room. Burned everything linking me to it. Then I made it look like Edwina had done it. I knew about her from Giles's letters. Jessica remained quiet. Finally, Peter whispered, I thought I was saving something, but I was just hiding behind ghosts. She reached into her coat pocket and removed the note from the ledger. This is going to Sergeant Trelaw. Peter nodded silently. That evening, in the sitting room of Bantry Grange, Jessica and Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire. So, said Miss Marple gently, the killer wasn't a Radcliffe after all. No, said Jessica, just someone who believed in the myth more than the truth. He thought protecting the past meant burying the truth, but it never works that way. And Edwina? Miss Marple asked. She'll be cleared. She wasn't innocent, but she wasn't the killer either. The clock struck 6. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the village breathed again. Will you stay on a few more days? Miss Marple asked. Jessica smiled. I think I've earned a scone and a week of peace.
Chapter 8. The Last Petal Falls. It was a clear morning in St Mary Mead. Sunshine returned to the village at last, gilding the cottage roofs and turning puddles to silver. For the first time in days, the air felt easy again, filled with a rustle of leaves and the distant bark of a dog. The heavy fog of suspicion had lifted, leaving behind only relief and the usual curiosity that clung to any village touched by murder. Jessica Fletcher stood in the rose garden behind Bantry Grange, a cup of tea warming her hands. Dolly Bantry joined her, carrying a tin of shortbread and wearing an expression halfway between apology and awe. I still can't believe it, Dolly said. Young Peter Abbott, such a polite boy, who'd have thought? Jessica gave a soft sigh. Polite boys are often the ones most tightly wound, Dolly. When people believe they're invisible, they often try to prove they matter, sometimes in the worst ways. From the gravel path came the sound of shoes, and Miss Marple appeared with a folded telegram in hand. I thought you'd want to see this, she said, passing it to Jessica. Jessica read aloud. Edwina Radcliffe released. No charges. Passport flagged. Will not return. London Police express thanks for your assistance. Well, Dolly muttered. She's not invited to next year's fête, I can tell you that. The three women shared a dry chuckle. Miss Marple poured herself tea. I must say I admired how cleanly Peter planned it. The cloak, the forged letters, even framing Edwina. He nearly succeeded. Jessica nodded. If he hadn't tried to plant that second button in the hedge, so theatrical, it might have worked. But real guilt never stays hidden. It leaks, in the way they speak, the way they watch others, afraid of being watched themselves. Miss Marple added, he wanted control. But guilt always controls you in the end. At that moment, Sergeant Trelaw arrived at the garden gate, cap in hand. Morning, ladies. Just wanted to say thank you, Mrs. Fletcher. Wouldn't have cracked this one without you. Jessica smiled modestly. Peter gave himself away. I just listened. Trelaw nodded. He's confessed to everything. The forged accounts, the stabbing, the cover-up. Said he never expected it to go that far. Thought Giles would be scared into silence. Violence rarely stops at one blow, Miss Marple said. Trelaw looked at Jessica. He asked if you'd visit him. Said he wants to explain. Jessica hesitated. Perhaps, but what he needs now is a solicitor and a mirror. Trelaw gave a respectful nod and left. Dolly cleared her throat. So, what becomes of the fête then? Cancelled forever? Miss Marple smiled. Oh, I suspect next year's fête will be very well supervised and far less profitable. Jessica grinned. And perhaps someone other than a... That afternoon, Jessica walked to the library one final time. The building was quiet, sunbeams spilling across the reading tables. It smelled of paper
and lavender floor polish. She paused beside the now-repaired lectern, then turned into the ledger room. Fresh paint now covered the soot stains. On a shelf near the back was a small blue volume she hadn't noticed before. Poems of the English countryside. She opened it. Inside was a handwritten inscription. To Mrs. Fletcher, for seeing what others overlooked. With gratitude, Beatrice C. Jessica smiled gently. As the sun set over St Mary Mead, the village green came alive with laughter. A modest replacement for the fête had been arranged. Tea tables, bunting, and no politics. Children chased hoops between the stalls. The vicar offered lemonade instead of sermons, and at one table, Jessica sat beside Miss Marple, enjoying a warm slice of strawberry tart. "It's strange," Jessica said, "how murder unearths so much that has nothing to do with death at all. Greed, fear, old secrets. And yet," Miss Marple replied, "it always brings out the truth." Jessica looked out over the villagers. Peter Abbott's cottage was shuttered now. Beatrice had returned to her work, and Edwina's name was being quietly scratched off plaques around the library. "Do you ever get tired of it?" Jessica asked. "Of seeing people unravel?" Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "No, because it reminds me how important it is to look closely. People hide things, sometimes out of guilt, sometimes out of love, but the truth is always there, waiting to be noticed." Jessica smiled. "That's what makes you such a fine detective." Miss Marple gave a modest shrug. "I prefer to think I'm just a good neighbor." That night, Jessica packed her suitcase and set it beside the bed. The moonlight through the curtains bathed the room in silver. She sat at the desk and began her next manuscript. It started with a red cloak. In a village of blossoms and bunting, a murder bloomed quietly under the surface. But as always, the truth was not in the blade, nor the blood, but in the people who spoke just a little too carefully. She smiled and wrote the title, The Mystery of Blossom Lane.